So where did you come from originally?
Okay, well, I did an economics degree as an undergraduate student way back in 1971 to 75, and became horrified with what I was being taught, courtesy of being exposed to a flaw in the theory, which you don't normally learn in first year. I had a very lucky to have a first year lecturer who'd already himself broken away. And as soon as I saw that flaw, I just thought, this is nonsense. There's got to be something wrong with this discipline. Started reading the journals rather than the textbooks, and then found all the enormous holes in economic theory. And I've been fighting the delusions of mainstream economics ever since. And I became an academic after about 20 years of being in the various forms of private and public sector, and then have continued this fight. And only in 2019, I'm sorry to say, did I actually read economists on climate change, because I thought I had to wait until I'd made a positive contribution to the literature, which I did with a paper talking about the role of energy in production, which economists don't understand. And having done that, I started reading the neoclassical garbage on climate change, and I was beyond horror. So ever since then, which is 2019, I've been trying to alert people to how dangerously bad their work is. And this is the major reason why policymakers have not been listening to scientists. Uh, my little analogy, which I'll elaborate on when we start talking, is that it might be fossil fuel companies that have fought the war against action on climate change that have given them the weapons to fight that war.
Lay denial and not really knowing what they're talking about, I suppose.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you can take us to that moment when because I heard you say something on a video recently where you realized that this um, classical economist that everybody lauds was fundamentally flawed, and he even admitted that, his theories fall down in a certain place. I'm curious, because you were a first year student at the time, you were 18 years old. What did that make you feel like, considering this is the path you had chosen for your life? Like, what?
Oh, I think I warned about the financial crisis back in 2006 to 2007, because I knew that I mean, it did work which explained why it would happen, which is working on what's called Hyman-Minsky's financial instability hypothesis modeling. That was my PhD thesis. And so that gave me a perspective on the role of private debt in capitalism, which mainstream economics argues has no role. And I knew they were wrong. And so it happened for various reasons. I didn't get back into that research until late 2005. And then I looked at the trend in debt to GDP and thought, somebody has to warn about this, at least in Australia where I was then, I'm that someone. And then I became prominent as one of about a dozen or so economists who were acknowledged as having warned of the crisis before it happened. So I've always been, in that sense, a critic of the mainstream. But at least with the global financial crisis, government spending could do something to counteract the collapse in private sector spending. And as badly as it was done, that's why the financial crisis didn't turn into the Great Depression. This time, when I read this stuff, I instantaneously knew when I read one sentence, I'll explain that sentence in a second, that they were deluded and dangerously deluded. And that was a line by Richard Toll in a paper called The Economic Effects of Climate Change, written in 2009. I read it sitting exactly where I am now in 2019. And he said that Mendelssohn is talking about techniques by which they try to quantify the impact of climate change. And he explained the first technique, which is called the enumerative approach. And I'll detail that during my talk, but that didn't inherently sound crazy. He said that the enumerative, they take damage, physical damage estimates by climate change scientists, and then put a price on them. That sounded okay. I've got to wait and see what you did, but it isn't an immediate reason to reject them. The next thing was the sentence which began, Mendelssohn uses what's called the statistical approach. Mendelssohn assumes that variation in climate and economic activity over space will hold over time as well. And I thought, you fucking idiots. If that's what you've done, you've immediately trivialized the dangers of climate change. And I was horrified. And I basically, I just literally, this is my God, because there's no cure for this like the financial crisis. And my wife walked in, and she's Buddhist, and saw me in this state like this, said, "What's wrong?" And I said, "Oh, I'm just reading this stuff on climate change." And her reaction was very Buddhist. She said, "Oh, why do you read that stuff Nobody wants to know about it. You can't change anything. If we die, we die, which is a very, Buddhist way to look at the possibility. But I thought, well, yeah, fair enough. That might be true, but I'm going to do what I damn well I can to expose them before they destroy human civilization. And I truly do believe their work is going to be one of the two major reasons that human civilization probably will end this century. And the other, of course, being self-interest of fossil fuel companies. But this is delusion from economists that has really legitimized the nonsense that the fossil fuel companies have pumped out. They've played the role of the scientists who are willing to say that smoking was good for your health.
So, considering that you've been fighting for so long, first against classical economics, and then with the climate change angle that you became aware of, how is it that you maintain your resilience? Because I mean, a lot of people would agree with your wife, and just it's insurmountable and it's
It, it's a
overwhelming. So
it's
what
a
keeps you
it's a good.
going?
I think I must have a ludicrous tolerance for stress. And I think
Hmm.
once you become an iconoclast, and in some ways I was iconoclastic at school in various things. I don't know where it comes from. But once you've made that break, your own sanity can't let you go in the opposite direction. So I'm not going to say that I walk in the shoes of Galileo or Boltzmann, but if you are somebody who believes the mainstream is wrong and you have a legitimate proof as to why, there's nothing you can do as a human being than to continue working on that. The only alternative is to, abandon your whole profession and go do something else. I could have become a figure skater maybe. Um, but once I'd taken it on, I ended up working in education for a short while, then overseas aid, then moved into journalism. But in all these cases, I was taking on mainstream beliefs, not fundamentally. And then when I went back, I decided the pivotal point for me was in my mid 30s, literally when I was one third of a century old. I was working in a part of the government that was supposed policies between business trade unions and and uh, uh, the government. And I realized that I was being stopped at every element by neoclassical economists inside Treasury and inside government departments and so on. And I thought the only thing I can do is go and take on these bastards at the source. Go to where they're generated, go to where the terminators are bred, and that meant going back to doing a master's and then PhD at university, and then taking on the profession from within. And I seriously did not expect I'd be playing the role of a leading figure in all this stuff, that I'd be communicating other people's critiques and other people's alternatives. I've done that, but I've also developed my own, and I ended up being probably the best known critic of mainstream economics on the planet now. And I'm going to keep on doing it till I die, and hopefully some of them are going to die before I do.
Well, as you say, it keeps you young, and that's actually like the single most important thing about activism I wish people understood, or just fighting for your beliefs, because that's all activism is, right? I mean, everyone's an activist for something they love, but the compulsion that we feel, because even if there's anger and rage and we're looking at dismal statistics all the time, there is a sense of peace and self-therapy, I think, that comes from that. Because
Yeah, that's
otherwise, I
true.
mean, what do you have? Paralysis and self-hatred and living in your cognitive dissonance, and there is no turning back and unseeing it. And if you unsee this, you just see yourself as not being strong enough and having agency in your own life, and that's no way to live, you know? So
Exactly.
I
No,
love that you
that's
spoke to
very
that.
true. I find a lot of people who support me, and
So,
I'm these days I'm crowdfunded on Patreon and Substack, and I'd appreciate some support from people who watch this seminar, because my finances are pretty bad right now. There've been a large drop off in donations over the last 4 years, but I think people who support me would have liked to do what I'm doing to some extent, and at least supporting me as a way of saying, well, I did a different career, but I can help out here. And I think for everybody who's doing anything on these issues and thinking outside your own personal circle, is because you have empathy for humanity and empathy for life on this planet, and you do what you can.
that is actually one of the predicating factors for becoming an activist is a sense of interconnection and ethics, but especially just feeling like part of a greater whole. And, I mean, the way I view things in life is very we are all, like I am you and you are me and we belong to each other.
Mm.
So you
Yeah.
doing this is, in some extended sense, all of us doing this, right? Because that's
Yeah.
what's beautiful about the interdependent organism. We can all fight
Yeah.
this fight, and we all are all over the world.
Dirk just asked how to support me. At the moment, financial. I'm about to try to launch a commercial business to mean that I can fund myself. But in the meantime, I can only continue doing this and, you know, by being supported on Patreon and Substack. So that's the main way you can support me right now. Hopefully, in a short while, you can support me by buying a commercial program I'm writing for the business intelligence market called Ravel. And I intend selling that and then financing what I'm doing because the great weakness for non-orthodox economists is we never get decent funding. We're always shunted to poor universities. We'll never be able to take the mainstream on unless one of us can manage to throw large amounts of money at the non-orthodox world. And that's what I'm trying to do. But at the moment, I'm just surviving on charity.
Well, and we on yours because you're here to share with us your knowledge and understanding. And so I think it's a good time to move into the presentation
Sure.
to see what you come to share with us today.
Okay, so I'll take over the screen here, and about 25 to 30 minutes, I think. So let's hit the road. I'll just actually get rid of this meeting control thing here as well. Okay, so we're ready. Let's roll. So that's the title of a report I wrote for Carbon Tracker, and I think there's a Carbon Tracker person or two here in the audience. So many thanks to Carbon Tracker for giving me an avenue to take this work forward. Because again, it's very hard to get people to think about something as long term, what they think is long term, as damage to the biosphere. But most people worried about damage to their hip pocket. So we went this attack of saying your pensions are going to be at risk, but really what's at risk is your lives, because we're talking about things which are going to happen, not in 80 years. If we're lucky, maybe 8 years. So here, those are my two sites, the Patreon and Substack, where I have a collection based on the work I've been doing on climate change, and I'll add this one to it shortly. And that's about the best semi-mainstream newspaper article I've been able to get out there by Christopher Ketchum, talking about the nonsense that neoclassical economists do. Chris did a lot of other work apart from working on from my research, but that is based substantially on the work that I've done here and that I'll be presenting today. And like normally, I talk to people who don't know anything about climate science. I mean, people in finance and people in economics. They haven't got a clue, so I've got to bring them up to speed. I'm assuming that people here are knowledgeable. Uh, Correct me if I'm wrong with later after I finish this one. So rather than saying, why does climate change matter? The question I really want to pose is why haven't scientists been listened to on global warming? Because you can see that lament permanently and justifiably in the writings that climate scientists do, and it's why Extinction Rebellion was formed in so many ways. And the briefer answer is because of economists, because this is a couple of economists, or one economist and one wanker. You'd all know Bon Lomborg, I'm supposed, is a well-known climate change denier. Tim Walsall, moderately amusing commentator on the free market. So he's not anybody who's got any significance in this debate. But his reaction up there, who are these people? Risk of hot summer, more than twice the normal? This is a risk of Britons wearing shorts and shirts for a few weeks? Yeah. Is this a commenting on obesity? That's the sort of level of analysis that most economists apply to climate change. Now, we all know that Don Lomborg is a well-known climate trivializer. What you maybe don't know is that when he puts numbers into this stuff, he's using the work of economists like Nordhaus. This is actually an extract from Nordhaus, a paper by Nordhaus, and all that Lomborg has done here is put a couple of commentaries on it. But what's saying, look, that's 4 degrees of warming. And all the dots there are predictions by economists about the impact of climate change. The size of the circles are the weight that Nordhaus applied to their predictions in a statistical fit of those two curves there, both of which are quadratics. And that predicts that 4 degrees of warming will cause less than a 5% fall in GDP. And that's even more trivial than you might think, as I'll explain in a moment. So Nick Cohen is one of the first climate scientists I've worked with who realized, holy shit, this is why we haven't been listened to seriously. Solid economics that knows nothing about climate impacts on human civilization. Economics papers reviewed only by fellow economists. And that's fundamentally what the problem has been. I want to go through why that is, what's been the impact of that. So if you look at the numbers they've made up, I mentioned the first one The first technique that Toll mentioned in that paper was called the enumerative approach. And that's what this, the point about the enumerative approach is they say we take damages estimated by climate scientists and add them up with prices and quantities added to them. But as I put it in the Carbon Tracker report, it's what you don't count that counts. What did they leave out in the numerative method? Here we go. This is the first time it was done. This is by Nordhaus in 1991. He said he's showing a breakdown of the United States national income, where you divide the economy into sectors on the basis of how exposed they are to climate change. He said agriculture and forestry are going to be heavily exposed. At the other extreme, cardiovascular surgery and microprocessor fabrication. He said these are taken in carefully controlled environments that will not be directly affected by climate change. All right, okay, maybe. Okay. He said 3% is in exposed sectors, 10% in moderately, and 87% of the economy is in sectors that will be negligibly affected by climate change. And he then elaborates for the bulk of the economy, manufacturing, mining, utilities, finance, wholesale and retail trade, and most of its industries, it is difficult to find major direct impacts of the climate change over the next 50 to 75 years. You instantly know you're not dealing with a scientist here. This is his table 5. I've summarised it in this paper. So 3% of the economy, farms and forestry, 10% construction, water, blah, blah, blah. Negligible effect, manufacturing and mining, 26% of the economy. Other transport, 5.5%, finance, 11.5%, etc., etc. The total's 87%. Now, the thing I find quite amusing, mining, even if you think about, open cut mining, that's exposed to climate change. Surely, dear William, surely that happens in the open. And somebody must have told him about that because he later, just a couple of years later, he did a revised version of this and said underground mining. Okay. Now that is a real give. That shows that he basically thinks a roof will protect you from climate change. That's what he means by carefully controlled environments, not exposed to the rain. That is just crazy, but that is where they're coming from. So he equates direct interaction with climate, which is phrased from that paper, with exposed to the weather. Then the space equals time delusion. Now, this is the quote that I've said that had my hands in my head when I first read it. Based on direct estimates of welfare impacts using observed variation across space within a single country, they've now gone across space across the entire planet. That's really improved things immensely. And then said Mendelssohn assumes that the observed variation of economic activity with climate over space holds over time as well. And that's when I just thought, you assholes, you idiots, you're dooming us to death. So what they're doing is using geographical variation of temperature and income as a proxy for climate change. And that's obviously no comprehension about ergodic versus non-ergodic systems. This is a paper linked to a paper saying that the climate is clearly non-ergodic. But he defends this stuff in Twitter. So this is a battle that when I first read this stuff the same day, I engaged in a fight on Twitter because fortunately a friend of mine had pointed to an article by another economist which he called pure garbage, and I then dived in. Then you have this is Toll, who's I'd regard him as the sort of defender, the enforcer of the mainstream thinking within the mainstream group. 10K, 10 Kelvin. It's less than the temperature distance between Alaska and Maryland, like over in Florida. Climate is not a primary driver of income. Now, a lot of you might know Daniel Swain, a meteorologist, has become heavily involved in this area. He dived in as well and said 10 degrees warmer than present is not remotely the same thing as just adding 10 degrees to current temperatures. And Toll comes back and fights with the climate scientists. And this is typical. We observe people thrive in very different climates, and some thrive in the same climate. And he said, and if a relationship does not hold for climate variations over space, you cannot confidently assert that it holds over time. In other words, let's assume the real world is ergodic, which is a sign of how little they know about the real world. Now, the next thing they do, having made these estimates, of course, trivial estimates of damages, how did they extrapolate them forward? By using a quadratic. And that's part of it. Actually, that's coming part of one more. So I'm going to go backtrack a bit on that. What they're doing is using current GDP and current temperature. Now, what actually probably happened is some bright spark economist said, "Oh, we've got data on temperature and GDP between 1960 and 2014. And temperatures changed between 60 and 2014. So now we can relate GDP to change in temperature as well. And this is a paper, I'll come back to this one in a bit of detail later on. They said that if temperature rises by 0.01% over a long period of time, get a 0.05% change in the level of economic activity, not the rate of economic growth, but the level of economic activity. This is how they put it forward. So the dots you can see there are previous forecasts by economists. The shaded area is their prediction. You don't need to be a mathematician to know that's a linear extrapolation. But that linear extrapolation is across the temperature change from about 0.8 or about say 1 degree C, which is where we were roughly where we were when they started doing this research, out to 4 or 5C, straight through every tipping point you care to name. They're just linearly extrapolating as though the relationship is going to apply indefinitely. And the most extreme prediction they make in the literature is this one here: 4 degrees of warming, reduced GDP by 23%. Now that the economists will actually quote that to me. So what about Burke and co? Well, what Burke did is notice this assumption here: if future adaptation mimics past adaptation, which is another way of saying it, what we see across geography happens across time. Okay. The same story, and the paper, that's the biggest number they've got, and it's dreadfully badly researched, but highly elaborate and technical in how they go about it. So the other thing they do, and this is why I jumped ahead of myself briefly a while ago, is when they do any extrapolation or when they fit what they call data, they use a quadratic. Y equals x squared, x being the deviation in temperature, y being the change in GDP. And they've been attacked for this time and time and time again. So Weitzman, you may know Weitzman as an economist who committed suicide shortly after Nordhaus got the Nobel Prize for climate change research rather than him. Pindyck has been attacking them quite vigorously, and this is, in economic literature, this is quite a vicious attack. The damage function is made up of thin air. It isn't based on any economic or other theory or data. Okay? Quite true. Okay? Now, you would think there'd be some sort of reaction to that. No, they've just continued using it. This is a paper in 2021 using, I think they use 2.6 as the exponent rather than 2. But exactly the same thing, quadratic. This is second order polynomial. This is what they use for fitting tipping points. So they just stick to what they use. They criticize the hell out of them. They'll keep on doing the same old shit. And one of the most remarkable things, I think, from the point of view of climate scientists is they don't use what the GCMs. They made up their own things they call IAMs, integrated assessment models. And they do not include rainfall. All they've got is temperature. And this is Dietz et al. Talking about a paper on the impact of losing the AMOC, which is one of the paper that Richard Toll is still touting around today. And that paper, which says if we lose the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, that will boost global GDP. Why? Because it reverses part of the temperature increase caused by global warming. Now, he had to admit, oh, we've left rainfall out of there. How does he talk about it? Integrated assessment models often assume that other climate variables scale with temperature. In other words, we assume if temperature gets better, then so will rainfall. Now, if you get a genuine scientist doing this work, and Tim Lenton is my favorite in this run, I'm sure a lot of people know the work of Tim Lenton. He did a GCM and applied it to the situation of a 2.5-degree increase in temperature with or without loss of the AMOC. And his conclusion was a 70% fall in the amount of land which would support basically the major grain crops. And he said that'd have a catastrophic impact. These people are still touting Toll's piece of garbage as the way to look at the loss of the AMOC. And many other things they do. And this Nordhaus enforces this quite strongly. I've seen him do this in a seminar where someone was talking about damage to machinery, and he was vociferous in saying, no, it's only damage to GDP. So they assume that climate change and global warming will damage the output of factories, but won't damage the factories themselves. Now, if you think that's crazy, you're right. And here's how they say they're crazy. This is the documentation for the model called PAGE, which is one of the three main IAMs are called PAGE, which is done by Chris Hope, Fund, which is done by Toll, and DICE, which is done by Nordhaus. And he said, possible endogenous effects are not included. into the 4-page setting. What does that actually mean? Okay. So we assume that any damage done to machinery is repaired in the same year as to which it happens. Then we're going, so a conservative assumption that all climate-driven losses are fully repaired in the end of each year, and even better, miraculously, without any cost, not included in the cost overall. So this implies the impacts do not propagate beyond the year during which they occur. Now, I don't need to tell economists, scientists about the difference between a simplifying assumption and a fantasy. They think this is a simplifying assumption. It's a fantasy. The damages persist for decades, as we know from events like Katrina and so on. Then they'll survey people to get other opinions, but they're surveying themselves. This is a survey done in 2021. 2,200 people were surveyed. 738 responded, quite a high response rate. About one half of them answered this question, saying, given this trajectory of temperatures, so 1.2 degrees by 2025, because we already know we're at 1.5 right now, 3 degrees C by 2075, 5 by 2130, and 7 degrees increase in temperature. Asking the question shows you don't know what you're talking about, let alone answering it as they did. But the median estimate was that fall in increase in temperature would reduce global GDP by 20%. And now when you look at it, and this is the next trick I'm getting onto, a 20% fall in GDP by the year 2220, 2 centuries away, translates into a 0.1% fall in the annual rate of economic growth. And that's the accuracy with which they measure economic growth today. And most of their estimates are below that level. So what they're saying is the impact of climate change on the economy will be unmeasurable. That's their excuse in many ways for using this future GDP damage rather than the actual growth rate level. Now, if you know as for a scientist, you would probably know Zimmerman Ramanathan's paper, one of many, giving some sort of quantification and saying anything above, 3 degrees, 1.5 degrees is dangerous, 3 is catastrophic, 5 is potentially an extinction level event. And these idiots think 7 degrees of warming will just reduce future GDP by 20%, but that translates as a ridiculously small reduction in the rate of economic growth. So here's Burke saying, and we're talking about a 23% fall. And then this is the IPCC. And this is the real danger. Because of the siloization we all know happens with academic research, the economists publish their chapter in the IPCC, the scientists publish their many chapters. Who do you think the politicians read? Who do you think their advisors read? They read the chapter written by the economists. This is the 2022 IPCC report, so very, very recent. And the extreme, no, the 23%, that's the one from Burke and Co. that I showed a short while earlier. That's what the politicians' advisors go and read. They go back and tell the politician, oh, Jack, you're going to have to pretend you care about this stuff, but it's pretty trivial and it won't happen for at least 80 years. So Jack or Jill, or whoever the politician is, goes and does hand-wringing stuff in front of the media and then does bugger all about it in terms of policy. Now, it looks like a big number, 20%, but when you do the conversion formula, it's quite simple. You take the loss they're talking about and how many years in the future it is. That ratio, the log of 1 minus the GDP loss as a fraction divided by the number of years, tells you the impact on the rate of economic growth. And the average rate of economic growth, roughly speaking, for the whole of the 20th century is about 3% per annum, total real economic growth. Now, the most severe estimate is that one by Burke and Co. that I showed earlier, the 23%. When you convert that into a rate of economic growth, it means a 0.3% fall in the annual rate of economic growth. So rather than increasing at 3% per annum, it'll be increasing at 2.7% per annum. And that's their biggest estimate. When you feed it all the way through and say, what do all these estimates look like? These are the sorts of numbers you get. So there's the biggest, Burke and Zhang. This one is the one that central banks tend to use, Gohold and Wentz. I've linked to all the papers there, by the way. Howard and Sylvan, that's the one I've just shown you, the survey of all those economists. But most of them are below the level of resolution, so to speak, of estimates of GDP today. And yet at the same time, they think that they're doing useful work here. Now, people might think, don't they read climate scientists? Well, the answer is sometimes, but look at how they read them. This is Tim Lenton's paper, which ends up with this conclusion. A variety of tipping elements could reach their critical point within this century. the Arctic and Greenland, and Tim has since revised the Arctic out of the definition of tipping points, which I'm happy to talk about in a moment. But you had 9 in the paper, said 2 are going to go, and another 5 could go this century. So that's obviously saying it matters, and it's going to happen this century. I only found out about this paper initially by reading Nordhaus's manual. And then he justified using a quadratic damage function on the basis of a survey by Lenton. And so I went looking for Tim's work and I found this. This is how Nordhaus summarizes Lenton's work in his book, The Climate Casino. Their review finds no critical tipping elements with a time horizon less than 300 years until global temperatures have increased by at least 3 degrees Celsius. Okay. Now that's Dr. Pangloss. How the fuck he could read Tim's article and make that conclusion is simply beyond me, except to say he's wearing road-coloured glasses, he sees what he wants to see. And that's how they respond to this literature. If any school student submitted Nordhaus's summary of Lenton's paper in a comprehension test, I would fail them. This guy gets the Nobel Prize in economics. Now, why do they do this shit? Okay? Why on earth do they produce this garbage? What the hell is their motivation? And it's not because they're getting any money out of this. I mean, some of them do get paid to do some consulting, generally speaking, but it's not money that's motivating them. The real thing is they're trying to hang on to their paradigm. This is what I've been fighting myself for the last God knows how many years, 50 years. They believe they have a market-oriented, equilibrium-obsessed paradigm of how capitalism actually functions, and it's full of holes. There's 2 of my books on the topic. It deserves to be attacked, but they felt themselves under attack when The Limits to Growth was published. Now I've become a friend of Rander's. I don't know him all that well, but we've met and we enjoy each other's company when we get a chance to get together. And he told me way back in the early 2000s that when he and Meadows and co published The Limits to Growth, they thought economists would be pleased because with system dynamics, they developed a technique that could free economists from having to assume equilibrium. They were completely caught out of flummoxed by the aggressive reaction they got instead, and Nordhaus led the fight. So this is what if anybody hasn't read The Limits to Growth, these are their predictions. You might notice the graph starts at 1900 and finishes at 2100. It's deliberately got no numbers down here because they said they weren't trying to give an accurate direct prediction. But if you take a look at the turning point in food per capita, pretty much a couple of years ago, turning point in population, 2070, et cetera, et cetera. So this was seen by economists as a huge attack on the market-oriented model because the only way Limits to Growth said we could avoid these consequences is by controls on population growth, controls on pollution, controls on energy. Control is what they did not want. They didn't want the market to be dominated. And the very first major paper in the whole literature, and this is, so we're talking, Nordhaus is roughly my age, so he's a few years older than me. He would have been a 22 or 25-year-old newly minted PhD, at a guess at the time. So he made his mark by attacking the predecessor to The Limits to Growth by Forrester called World Dynamics. And he got a publication in the Economic Journal, number 2 or 3 journal in the world. So this is high-ranking stuff for him. He would have been celebrating when he got this publication. And this is how he talked about world dynamics. It can be summarized as measurement without data. He then said 43 variables, 22 nonlinear relationships. Not a single relationship or variable is drawn from actual data or empirical studies, and that is bullshit. Okay? You can see Forrester's reply to this in the paper I've linked there. But when you look at what actually happened, they did an expansive a set of expert surveys on the various parameters they included in the model, basically 5 system states. And this is what they did on population. So it's all inside this book, Dynamics of Growth in a Finite World. That's about a 500-page book going through all the work they did to survey the experts and then putting the model in more detail still. They didn't publish that before The Limits to Growth, unfortunately. They decided to get it refereed before it was published. So this came out after Nordhaus had successfully trashed the entire Limits to Growth analysis. What they did in Limits to Growth was work out what they saw as the major parameters determining the viability of the global economic and ecological system. And they then works heavily with experts to say, well, this is the actual data, crude birth rate, crude death rate, population growth, industrial output per capita, et cetera, getting relationships between them. They worked out the five or so, I think either five or seven, I've forgotten I think it's five system states. And they then made sure that they, having produced an index of each of those states, they made sure their model could reproduce what they had in the data. And then they simply ran the model. Once they saw from 1900 to 1970, the parameters they've used fitted the data that they'd worked together to get for the period from 1900 to 1970, they simply ran the model forward to 2100. And, and that's what gave us the limits to growth. But none of that was known by economists. They disparage and trivialize the limits to growth. Most of them haven't read it. But that drove system dynamics out of economics. It kept to preserve the domain for equilibrium thinking in neoclassical economics. And what the Nordhaus then did about 15 years later is take what's called the Ramsey growth model, which is an equilibrium model. Ironically, an equilibrium along it's a saddle node equilibrium, which any sensible person knows is unstable. But the neoclassical economist turned this into an equilibrium model. And he used that in the place of system dynamics. And that meant that suddenly economists were using what economists preferred to use to analyze climate change. And then those crazy assumptions I've been through already, he used to set the parameters on the DICE model. And then you had people like Toll producing fund and Christopher Hope producing Page producing Hope or Hope producing Page. I keep on getting confused on that one. And that gave us what is actually a tiny niche of economists working on this, because most economists avoid the area. So there, as I mentioned, that Howard and Sylvan survey found 2,200 economists who published in the top 25 journals. And that's a lot of people, but it's only about 3% of the total population of academic economists. And Oswald and Stern is making up for the damage he did with the Stern report. I'm happy to talk about that, why I see it as damaging, by starting to say, look, we've done a lot of bad work here. And what they decided to do with his partner, Oswald, here, is look at how many articles have been published on climate change, not in the top 25 journals, but the top 9. And the answer was less than 100. Most of these by people like Nordhaus, too, by the way. So what it means is it's not a way for most economists to get publications. It's just a particular subgroup of economists have chosen this as a way of getting publications. And then they basically talk to each other, refer each other's papers, think out new ways to modify each other's analytic approaches. That little subgroup of 2,200 people are the ones who are leading us to ruin. Now, again, why does this happen in economics in general? And I have taken to calling Roderick Toll an idiot to his face, at least on Twitter. And the reason is because you would know the concept of an idiot savant. Somebody who's got enormous processing power for some strange neurological reason on some particular area of reality and is useless on everything else. And this phrase was actually first used by a critic back in the 70s. I think it's Robert Reich, but I'll have to check the name and see. But in 1991, there was a report commissioned by the American Economic Association into graduate education, and it then used that same line, and it said mastery of technique has supplanted mastery of intuitive economic analysis. And the Commission's fear is that graduate programs may be turning out a generation with too many idiot savants, skilled in technique but innocent of real economic issues. Well, they were right. And the real danger now is it isn't just that it's turning out idiot savants. The idiot savants are now training new entrants. It's even worse. They're locked in. And they actually think they're doing useful research. So I'm going to shut up for a moment and show you, met somebody to the meeting here, and show you the way that Kamiyama Hardis, who's one of the people who wrote this paper, talking about a 7.22% fall in future GDP from another 3.2 degrees of warming, how he promotes his work for Cambridge University. So have a listen to this. And this is the argument they gave in the paper. A 0.04% increase per year, which translates as 3.2 degrees C over 80 years. So that'll be more than 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels by 2100. That'll make GDP 7.22% lower than it would have been without global warming. So here's how he explains his research.
Steve, I think that you might have to reshare because you should check that box that says optimize for video so the sound also comes through into the meeting.
So sorry, pardon? Was that Titania?
Yeah, if you stop your share and then share your screen again, you have to check
Oh,
the box at the bottom that says optimize for video so that the sound
oh,
comes
okay.
through.
Okay, so I'll go back and I'll start that again. So thanks for that interruption. Okay, let's see. So where's, sorry, I'm not doing a good job here. Where is that? Optimized for
You're
video?
doing
Or,
great. No, no, no. I think you have to stop the screen share and then try to share again. So when the
oh,
share
okay.
box comes up
So
on the
stop
bottom
share.
left,
Okay. Okay, I'll go
mhm,
back on a share screen again. Okay. Here we go.
bottom left, there should be a checkbox. Yep,
That look okay. Let's see. Optimize.
for sound. It should, or optimize for video playback, I think it should say.
I can try and look and see what I can see though. Let's see. Hang on. Optimize a video clip. There we
Yes,
go.
yes.
Okay. That better?
Okay, okay.
Okay.
Let's
Now it's
see.
right.
Let's see.
We use data on 174
Now we can hear it.
countries
Yeah,
over the
yeah.
last half
Can you take it
century.
back to the beginning?
We also conduct a within country study of the US. We use data.
Hang on. Sorry. Pardon me. Pardon me. What's that? What's the instruction again, Titania? Is it okay now?
No, no, you, yeah, yeah, yeah. We can hear it now. You did. Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay. Sorry. I'll go back and I'll just do it right again. Here we go. Let's see. So here we go. Hang on. Just got to go back and share the screen yet again. Okay. Okay. Share screen. Okay. And then, okay. Optimize. So it looks like it's okay now. Good. Let's go.
We use data on 174 countries over the last half century. We also conduct a within country study of the US economy, using data at the state level and across 10 economic sectors. By looking at the US in detail, we are able to discuss the channels through which climate change affects economic activity. What we find is that climate variations, they lead to costly production volatility and have adverse effects on labor productivity, in line with our results at the cross-country level. They show that while adaptation might have reduced the negative effects in certain sectors, it has not completely offset them at the macro level. Those estimates that we get are based on two scenarios. One is the no mitigation scenario, and the second is in line with the Paris Agreement. And what we observe is that a commitment to the Paris Agreement would actually reduce the global losses substantially. In the most conservative scenario, the losses associated with climate change is around 7% of global GDP. It is equivalent to the combined GDP of Australia, Belgium, Canada, Germany, and South Africa. This is quite significant. So given that policy at the national level might have been influenced by previous studies arguing that climate change will lead to losses for hot and poor nations, but that advanced economies will not be affected or under some scenarios even benefit from higher temperature deviations, we are hoping that our research, which clearly shows that there are negative long-run growth effects of climate change affecting all or hot and cold, we're hoping that these results will change the mindset of policymakers, which believe that climate change will not impact their economies in a meaningful way.
So I think you can pick up from that speech by Camille. First of all, he's a very nice bloke, very nice human being, and he sincerely believes what he's saying. And it's totally ludicrous. It's just got to go. So what Tim Lenton and I are proposing on doing, and we haven't been able to get research funding yet. I'm hoping we can manage to do that at some point. Is to have a project to get rid of what economists have produced. And the way it would be twofold. First of all, survey climate scientists, as Howard and Sylvan surveyed climate economists, and that would be looking at everybody who's published on global warming in the top 25 science journals, which would probably give us over 10,000 scientists, and ask a version of that damage to GDP function question that Howard and Sylvan asked. Basic idea being, at what temperature level do you think human civilization will cease to exist? Now, we expect the median to fall between 3 and 5 degrees, which means, of course, completely different to what economists are talking about. And then we generate a logistic damage function from that versus the quadratic that economists do, and insist that economists have to use this damage function rather than the nonsense that they've made up. And the secondary thing is that if we don't get rid of the papers they've written on this topic, they're going to go back to them all the time. And funnily enough, they're, according to Toll, and I don't normally trust his numbers, but it's going to be of this order of magnitude, there's only 39 papers that have produced all this nonsense. There's thousands of papers on other topics, but just 39 working out what they see as the economic impact of climate change on reducing GDP. So you get 4 scientists per paper, pay them to do it, to referee those papers as they should have been done in the first instance, just looking at the actual scientific predictions by the assumptions by the economists. And I simply can't see anybody with a science background approving publication of any of those papers. So we then call on journals to withdraw those papers and try to drag the whole load of nonsense out of the literature. And then this is what we'd be doing to some extent. Tim and I both talk about this in our recent papers. Tim's being done with the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. And what we did, or what I did, and Tim thought it was a good idea, and we're now carrying on further, is the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, keeps this database right back to about 1980 on damages from different climate causes. So the count on this side is the number of events, which are the bars, and then the lines are the value of those events over time. And what I did in the carbon tracker report is fit that to both a quadratic, which neoclassicals use, an exponential, and also a logistic. And when you look at the actual data, they literally have got exactly the same correlation coefficient to 4 significant places out to about 1 degree of warming. Then they start to diverge. So you can't tell them apart from current data. But of course, if you extrapolate, the one that the economists prefer to use is the quadratic, and that says 6 degrees of warming, less than 20% damage to GDP. But the exponential and logistic basically say it's all over at 3 to 5 degrees. And we want to get politicians confronted with these numbers and not the bullshit that economists have put forward, which make it look like it's a trivial factor. So we have to drive them out. They've got to go. There's no point trying to reform them. They simply do not comprehend climate change. They've been doing this stuff for 40 years. There's no way they're ever going to understand it. Now, if we don't do it, then I think this cartoon is more than apt. Most of you would have seen this cartoon, I'm sure. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we've created a lot of value for shareholders. That's the mentality that you really can see lying behind economists. And that's my report. Just going through the various reports, that's my report. That's a supporting document for it. And that's my Substack and Patreon pages where you'll find more detail. And I want to finish with a suggestion, something that I'd like climate scientists to use. You can do a better job than I've done. But you would have all confronted the deniers who say carbon dioxide doesn't cause temperature. Forget about it. Don't look at carbon dioxide. Just look at temperature. So here is I've linked in by my papers to where this data comes from. This is data over the last 2,000 years. That's the hockey stick, as you can all tell. And of course, that's the Industrial Revolution. So off goes the increase in temperature. Now, if you go further back, you find that there's a clear peaking of global temperature about 6,000 BC. So what we're going through, and most of you know what I'm talking about here, it's the Milankovitch cycle. So that's when Cheops pyramid was built. We've now got Göbekli Tepe as the second oldest, as it happens now, mammoth structure we've found by humans in the period of sedentary agriculture. So if you now go back further again and say, let's look about 100,000 years, well, of course, that's the previous glaciation, not the last ice age, pardon me, it's the last glacial period. And that was 6 degrees cooler, so we think, than we are today. There's human civilization, just that tiny little peak on that hill there. If you go further back still and take a look at the last million years ago, then of course each of those peaks is a Milankovitch cycle peak, and we all know they're aperiodic, chaotic cycles driven by orbital variations for the Earth's orbit around the sun. Again, a tiny little peak here for human civilization. This is roughly when we evolved, so I've only been through 3 Milankovitch peaks over time since we evolved as a species. And if you go further back again and take a look at the last 2 million years, then this is where we've transited from a period without ice ages to a period with ice ages, where the Milankovitch cycles dominate. And if you go way back and look at the last 60 or 70 million years, then, of course, this one is the extinction of the dinosaurs here. So again, we're in a very strange period of the Earth's history when we're going through these glaciation cycles with variations of up and down 6 degrees every 100,000 years. But let's go back now and take another look at the most recent 100,000 years. Everything that we've done as a civilization was done in that blue region there. That's where we did literally everything. And if we'd been rational, we would have kept the planet's temperature at that level, and we'd end up in the Jetsons future that people all thought we were going to have back in the 1960s. If we didn't do that, then of course the Milankovitch cycles would have asserted themselves and we'd be back in the world of this character. But instead, what we're doing is increasing global temperature at roughly 30 times the speed of the Milankovitch cycle, which is not rational, it's not natural, it's suicidal. And I think that's what we need to get through to the rest of the world. But a huge part of getting through that is getting rid of the economists, who are the ones who are leading the suicide and don't even know they're doing it. Thank you.
You so much for a breathtaking talk. Probably more your breath than mine. But we have a lot of amazing questions that have come in, and we're trying to also pick up questions from the chat. So first, we'd like to go to Tim Martin of Declare Emergency. Scott, if you could please highlight him. Hey, Tim, great to see you again.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you for this wonderful talk and everything you're doing for the climate emergency.
Thank you.
My question I posed in the beginning was around what you might call the politics of this year's election cycle. But since you've mentioned the big picture of time and where we are with temperature, and I'm really glad you went way back to the fifth mass extinction, because there was a paper that Paul Beckwith published or reviewed about a few months ago on the Cenozoic carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide in deep time. And he was saying that, we've got this data now, and your data kind of looks like that time history that you just shared. And basically, what he was saying was that the current levels of basically doubling of carbon dioxide meant that we were back when like we were just cooling off enough to get ice to form on Antarctica for the first time, like 33 million years ago. And it's just insane, the fact that Jim Hansen is saying our sensitivity to doubling of carbon dioxide is way more sensitive than so I guess what I'm trying to say is, how much time do you think we have for your research to where, like, the train seems to have left the station in terms of the tipping points and what Hansen says about the two main characteristics of the climate system, which is inertia and momentum. And that kind of is like a preliminary question to my original question, which was, in this election cycle, is it better to hold our nose, like we've always heard, and pick the least harm option of, like, the Democratic Party, because everybody says Biden would have done more for climate already if he could have. But of course, as you have so eloquently pointed out, it's the economists, or what I like to call the wizard behind the curtain, who controls both parties. And the Atlas Network is involved in that, which Australia just had a beautiful expose about how that works. Or is it better to call the kettle black and say that both options are false choices to the madness, because both parties want endless economic growth on a finite planet. So my question is, would you recommend holding up a third-party candidate like Claudia de la Cruz, Party for Socialists and Liberation, because they're asserting real economic alternatives to this fantasy of economic growth. But no, everybody says it's a waste of vote and it's a vote for Trump.
Yeah, look, I'm afraid I'm going to go with a waste of time voting, unfortunately, because they're not going to have any impact. The only impact they'd have is taking votes away from Biden, so you'd get Trump. And like I mean, I laugh whenever I see Americans talking about defending democracy around the world. It'd be great to bring it in America in the first instance, because the only electoral system that is crazier and more stupid than well, actually, no, you're probably number one in the world, and the second worst is the UK. First past the post voting in the UK case, that stupid electoral college system you have, only two real candidate parties, etc., etc. States, it's just, don't talk about democracy until you've got one, is my advice to America. But in that situation, what you're going to have is if people don't vote for Biden, they're going to get Trump. That's it. Now, we saw what Trump did when COVID struck. I don't want that fuckwit anywhere near the dials of policy when global warming really hits. If we, for example, lose the Iowa wheat crop, okay, I don't want him deciding we've got to get gun ships to go to Ukraine and drag whatever wheat they've got left over there, or whatever he would do. Heaven help us. So at least I want somebody with some degree of rationality. And whatever I think about Biden on Palestine and so on, I have to say he's in terms of sensible decisions being taken quietly in the background, that seems to have been what he's done. So if he was there, we'd have at least some chance of some moderately intelligent understanding of the issues when they struck, and he might put sensible people in charge of relevant government authorities. So, I would love to vote for somebody who was genuinely progressive and genuinely understood the issues. But if you do that in America, you're going to get Trump. So I'm so sorry. Hold your nose and vote for Biden.
Is
Skylar next?
Yes.
Yeah.
Skylar, love, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah. So, I mean, thank you so much for this whole presentation. Someone's echoing.
We're hearing you fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah, thank you so much for doing that presentation. And I mean, I wanted to say, like, I've been studying on the energy side of this for years. Mm-hmm. And I mean, everyone seems to forget that the fossil fuel system and climate destruction are basically opposite sides of the same coin. I mean, yep. Land use being some percent of it and ag being some percent, but it's mostly the fossil fuel. And I mean, what we're finding is, like, I'm working with, I went through the UC Davis master's program, which is a whole offshoot out of UC Berkeley, and they're closely working with Sacramento, California. And so what we're looking at is basically we've got all this technology that based on our life cycle analysis, based on the physics. I know people say, extractivism is dangerous in general. And at the same time, my thing with that is, okay, if you have a proposal for how humanity will live without any extraction, let's talk about that. If not, a lot of the renewable tech we have is still orders of magnitude better than the fossil fuel. But then when we talk about deploying it, the whole thing going through California and the EU is all predicated on that traditional economics that, you just spent your whole presentation calling that bullshit.
Yep.
And it's this whole idea of we can't cause losses to shareholders. And so, you have like idiot savants left and right around that program. And when I tried speaking out about that, that was not a popular view with any of the funders. And so I'm wondering just like, how do you go about strategizing that? Because I mean, I'm on the side of wanting to be like, look, here's a bunch of action items. Just do these fucking action items so much faster than you are. And that's probably our best shot, at not running ourselves out to 3 degrees. If there's any chance of 1.5 left, it's it's to just mobilize like a military and rip out all the fossil equipment tomorrow, and it's
okay. To me, like we're going to cut you off to give other people a bit of a chance here. I take the point. What do we do? Well, firstly, yes, what you're talking about, like prepare for a far more rapid transition to non-fossil fuel, whether that's renewable or nuclear. Really, I don't care. Get as much potential reduction in the 85% of energy coming from fossil fuels, and increase in the remainder. But that won't be enough. I mean, we're already. I think in terms of like an analogy, when we're going to hit a brick wall, we're doing about 300 kilometers an hour towards a brick wall, about 10 meters away at the moment. So we're going to hit a catastrophe. And the real question is, what do you do after that? And in my feeling, only when we get a serious catastrophe, and I mean, as in hundreds of millions of white people dying, okay, not brown, forget about brown. We don't worry about brown people. If it's in Pakistan or Africa, we won't worry about it. It's got to be in Belgium or in the United States or some white country. Lots of people die doing that. People go, holy shit, this is serious. Well, in that situation, you have to ration. I'd abolish industries. I'd shut, tourism would be gone. Okay? No more international flights. Boom, they're all take a few percent out of carbon. No more Bitcoin. Anything you can eliminate straight away, and then rationing. So you try to avoid people starving to death. Okay, but you have to. This is mechanisms like we did for the Second World War, where as soon as it became obvious that it was, if UK didn't throw everything it had at producing and purchasing weapons to fight the Germans, then they'd be speaking German not long after. So in total war economy direction, and that meant rationing of everything. So you have to get rationing systems together. You have to, I'd eliminate private jets, okay? But funnily enough, I'd use private jets for sulfur dioxide seeding of the stratosphere because they can reach the stratosphere, whereas commercial jets can't, et cetera, stuff on that scale. And but we won't do it until after a huge catastrophe hits, because nobody, this is humanity in general, it isn't just economists here. We don't react to a crisis until that's after it's happened. And then the question is, do we react well enough to be able to reverse it? So I go for all the stuff you're talking about, which was unpopular with your contemporaries in that course. But I then also say we have to start preparing rationing schemes, developing our systems beforehand, because we know the policymakers aren't going to do it fast enough. But the main thing is to get people ready for a wartime economy. Level of restriction of consumption, focus upon alternative methods, and then we might have a chance.
Thank you so much for your questions, Scott. Yes. I was going to read a couple. Oh, okay. We can go to Alan. After Alan, I want to read a couple of people who've been waiting from the sheet.
Yeah. We'll give you.
What's your question?
Tip of that. Yeah, Alan, and we'll go to the list after that then. Okay. Yes, Alan.
Thank you. I have to say, the last few minutes that you spoke, I agree 100%. I come from a science background, and I would argue that our attempts to warn people for the last 50 years has been completely useless, and that the position you take is probably also going to have the same effect. And I think that's the reason for that. And I'm going to be very blunt here. Is that the problem is that the leaders of the world are under the influence of a sort of sociopathic narcissism, which allows them to value the profit in business sense over human lives. I would even disagree with you that the loss of white lives, the significant loss of white lives, would make any difference to the elite that is currently operating in control of the whole system. To back that up, I would note that a number of the elite have already started to build amazing underground bunkers, and Saudi Arabia is currently building the Line City, Neom, which is essentially a large cloistered habitat for rich people in the instance of a catastrophe. So, I mean, if I had the ability to start a pandemic that would reduce the genome of narcissism to zero and make everybody caring and looking after each other and cooperating rather than competing with violence, I would do it. the problem that I see right now, and I think in your last comment, you came up with the answer that I've also been favoring, and that is we have to prepare for a wartime effort if it's going to work. And if it's not going to work, we have to have a plan B, which is how do we make sure that human society, if it can, or even human species, survive in the mess that will come after that. If we allow the temperature to get up to 5 or 6 degrees, or even 4 or 5,
yeah,
we're done for.
Yeah, I think even 3. Yeah, like I agree. I mean, I'm hardly being an optimist even about my alternative. And my real puzzle is, what pockets of humanity might survive, and how do we avoid a Mad Max fate for everybody? Those are my, those are my perspectives. And I think also, I mean, I want to see a Nuremberg trial for these people. I think the economists who've done this stuff deserve a Nuremberg fate from start to finish. And at least if we do it, we've got some chance to bring about that change in attitude that we're talking about. Because, if narcissists end up swinging in the breeze, there may be a bit of a chance for a political shift, but I'm still incredibly pessimistic about the chance for even that.
Thank you for your question, Alan. So from the chat, I just wanted to read a question that Peter Garbett had, saying, whilst it's criminal that politicians know so little about climate science, isn't it equally bad that climate scientists know so little about or engage so little with politics and climate? And he did say not all climate scientists, by the way.
Look, I think that's true, but in a sense, that's why we manage to do the things we do in science. So the fact that you become obsessed about a particular detail of reality and then research it as deeply as you do, that's why we've accumulated the knowledge we have over the last quarter millennium. And I was actually asked on Nate Hagen's podcast some time back, what is my biggest fear? And I said, my biggest fear is losing human knowledge. So I've given up on saving human lives. I mean, I expect, I know Will Steffen said he reckons maybe 1 billion people could survive warming of 4 degrees of Celsius. I think he's an optimist. He was an optimist. But I was expecting deaths beyond anything we've ever experienced before. But the biggest danger would be retreating back to a pre-enlightenment, pre-scientific state, and in the tiny handful of survivors that come through this whole thing. So one of my major questions is, how the hell do we preserve the knowledge we currently have? What can we do? And in that sense, this could be make it look like I'm off with the fairies here, but I don't care. I'm just desperately hoping Musk manages to get his colony on Mars before we destroy the fucking place down here. People keep on saying, why don't we fix up here first? We won't. We're not going to fix up Earth first. We're going to destroy it first. So the only potential way that I can think of getting like a monastery in the medieval monastery preserving knowledge as we had back in the so-called dark ages is get our monastery on Mars. But otherwise, the biggest fear I have, we're going to lose all the knowledge. And knowledge isn't just textbooks and mathematical theorems. It's the machines that make the machines that make the technology that we live on. And if we forget that, we can imagine a future humanity, even like 50 years from now, maybe even 100 years from now, who wouldn't know what the hell a silicon chip is. And how the hell do you rebuild the knowledge we have now if you get to that state? But that's what I'm afraid of happening. I can't stand his bullshit either, but I can't stand the thought of humanity being wiped out. And so, I'd even support one of the other bozos if anybody's doing anything to get us off planet. That's about the only hope I can see for preserving the knowledge, because whoever gets us off planet, if you get off planet to survive, you've got to be technological.
You also have to make it with very few resources and nothing that's really renewable. But yeah, I mean, hopefully. Who knows? Who knows? Paul, would you like to come and ask your question, please?
Sure. Thanks as ever, Steve, for all you do.
Thank you, Paul.
Those of us in the kind of academic research and NGO who try to do stuff on this, like yourself, we occasionally have our successes in maybe delivering some embarrassment. And part of that is about language, and we try to translate the kind of things that you and others are saying and try to point that to economists and so forth. So just a quick, in a way, technical question, in a way that I struggle with a bit. You mentioned yourself this jargon, ergodic and non-ergodic. And I have struggled with how to present that in the best, clearest way to economists and others, because it's not a term that's in normal use, and therefore it's one of those terms I struggle to explain and therefore deliver with a punch.
Yeah, I mean, I use a simple example. The expert in that is Ole Peters, probably aware of the work of Ole Peters at the London Mathematical Laboratory. And Ole's doing great work to bring out the idea of the need to have understanding of non-ergodic systems in complex systems in general. But I was doing numerical examples like his stuff now 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and I was teaching in Australia. And one thing I used was if you have a gamble, which using what economists call expected value is worth undertaking. If you undertake that value, you go bankrupt. And the example is you have a gamble where you have I think it's a 50% chance of a 50% gain and a 50% chance of a 40% loss. And when you put that together in expected value terms, you get 100 turns into 105, and you should undertake the gamble. And that's across space. Okay. But if you then take that gamble out, you get a geometric series. So each time you do the gamble, if you win and lose, win and lose, win and lose on a coin toss, each time you reduce your assets by 5%. So you can show that that example it's the best concrete example I've seen for people who don't understand this and don't have the mathematics to do it in general. So if you look on my Patreon or Substack website, you'll find an example of that, and it's taken from Ole Peters. And the idea is you either have with the typical choice they give students to teach them finance to say you either get $100 with certainty, or you have a 50% chance of 150 and a 50% chance, I think, of 60. And when you do the net present value, the value calculation, the expected value of 0.5 times 100 or 0.5 times 175 plus 0.5 times 40, you come out with a gain. Okay, it's more than 100. So the expected value calculations just take the gamble. But if you do a sequence of gambles, we get heads, tails, head, tails, head, tails. Each time you do it, you actually reduce your wealth by 10%. You keep on going, you take that gamble, you'll end up being worth 2 cents out of the 100 you started with. So that's the best way to get into people. I don't think ergodically, okay, about non-ergodic systems. If you do, you'll bankrupt yourself.
Right. Okay, thanks very much.
Who's next?
Okay, so next up, we have a question from, sorry, just trying to grab the name. Oh, I don't know this name. I think I don't have a name. But the question is, thanks very much for the presentation, your continued vital work. I want to ask what you think of degrowth as a solution to the many crises we face. And someone has a similar question about modern monetary theory and whether or not that's compatible with degrowth. So I think it makes sense to give you both of those at once.
Like degrowth, we're going to get degrowth one of two ways, by planning or by accident. An accident would be far more destructive than by planning. I think what's going to happen, we'll have it by accident. First of all, we'll start losing large parts of the economy and society through climatic events that none of us can predict because we've never done anything as stupid before. So, people will start to die in large numbers. Production systems will break down. The sustainability of society will become obviously challenged. So that's going to be the starting point. So we'll start with catastrophe. Then how do you plan degrowth once you realize it's going to happen no matter what? That really has to be focused upon rationing and drastic simplification. So Louis Vuitton gets shut down. In the luxury out of the world, nothing gets produced in luxury anymore. People working in tourism, you get a universal basic income. Okay? Anything which relies upon energy consumption, which we can eliminate rapidly, we give them a effective ration, which means they can stay alive, they don't die. But we don't want them working in their industry anymore. And we don't want them making profits out of that industry either. So it's drastic, absolutely drastic. This is, the most horrific change in direction in the history of humanity. That's what we need to be thinking in terms of. So, but again, it's, how do we get there? It isn't going to be easy. In that situation, the private money system will collapse. Private money is predicated on being able to make a profit out of making a loan. And that can happen. You can make a profit out of making a loan, and so can the person who borrows. But that requires upon a functioning market system. We won't have a functioning market system. And this is one of the ironies. Neoclassical economists started doing this garbage, Nordhaus in particular, to defend their paradigm, which is about a profit maximizing, utility maximizing vision of human civilization. To defend that vision, the impact of what they've done is going to destroy human civilization. But certainly what it will destroy is a private money system will go, and probably private production will continue, but under the same conditions we had during World War II, where the government was telling them what to do. And in that situation, the only form of money that's going to work is fiat money, government money creation. So I've done a huge amount of work on that front, as you know, as well. So again, take a look at my Patreon and Substack pages, and you'll see me explaining how a fiat money system works. When this collapse will be just entirely in a credit money, I don't think will exist. Banks will be reduced to being what neoclassical economists think they are, which is warehouses for our existing money. They won't be making money out of making loans.
Thank you for that. We can go to Aaron next. Aaron, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. What do you think about Brian Ches's trophic theory of money and the idea of externalities, it dealing with externalities within the model rather than externalities taking over naturally as things unfold?
I don't know that research, but what sounds what you're implying is putting a money value on the environment. Is that roughly speaking what's being talked about?
No, he's bounding the economic model with the ecological model.
Yeah, we need to do that ultimately. Yeah.
Yes.
We need to do that ultimately. So, like, one of my areas of research is the role of energy in production. And what I found quite remarkable is when you look at the raw data, it absolutely confirms my argument that energy, what we call GDP, is effectively energy transformed into useful work. So even though we don't have an energy-based monetary system, fundamentally our economy is energy-based, and so we don't want to have. I mean, I'm the global expert on how the monetary system works in terms of my Minsky software and how it models all that, and I defend the analysis on the basis we have to understand the existing system. But the existing system is partly why we've got into this problem. So you do need to have a system which constrains the amount of production, certainly on the biosphere. And that then means you would have to like a multidimensional form of money. If we do manage to reconstruct a civilization on this planet after we destroy the one we currently have, then we have to have one which takes account of the damage we do to the biosphere as well as the profit we get for ourselves. Whereas at the moment, the monetary system just focuses on the gain and doesn't even factor into the damage that we do in making that gain. So we do need it. But I hadn't had a chance to think about how it might be designed, but it would be something which meant that, the damage we do is taken into account, and the whole objective is to minimize that damage. We'll never get rid of it. We'll never eliminate it, but we have to get it to the point where it doesn't destroy the biosphere. And my main, when Nat asked me what humanity's role is, my attitude is the first focus of humanity should be on the preservation of life. And by life, I mean preservation of life on this planet. And that should be what our objective is as a species, not what we've allowed ourselves to fall into.
I think our next question comes from Liz Batten. She wants to know, I think the decision to decide to tackle the tobacco problem in the UK was eventually taken when the Treasury was persuaded that the benefits of mass quitting would outweigh the losses to the huge check they received each week from the tobacco industry. Is the Treasury being told about your work? Is anyone listening in the political world?
No, not at the moment. I mean, maybe somebody inside the Treasury has read my work. There's a possibility of that. But they're all neoclassical economists. And see, this is the trouble. They're all got this delusion that they've got the ultimate wisdom of the planet. If you want to see what they're like, there's a paper by a guy called Ed Lazaire, Lazear, called Economic Imperialism. And Ed, whom I met, is a very nice bloke, I've got to say. He died a few years ago. Ed was George Bush II, his chief economic advisor. And the paper he wrote called Economic Imperialism says economics is the only social science and we should take over all of the social sciences. And it was a paper, not that he just wrote out of the blue, he was commissioned to write it by the Quarterly Journal of Economics as a what's going to happen in the 21st century paper on economics. So the arrogance of economists is just incredible. That's why bloody Nordhaus would barge into climate change research in a way that no scientist would barge into economic research. It makes them incredibly arrogant. It makes them zealots about their vision of capitalism. So the likelihood is that people in the Treasury will be laughing about my work right now.
Let's see. Would you like to ask your question, love?
Oh, hello. I'm from the UK. I've been in the climate movement and Just Stop Oil for 2 years. And I'm not very good at speaking, I'm sorry, but I've been writing for about 2 years. I didn't even know I knew anything about economics. I had nothing. And a lot of what you're talking about is over my head, actually. I came off Action, what we call, just gluing myself to the road, and we stayed in safe houses, which were paid for by obviously in the linear economy, what I call the linear economy. We stayed in Airbnbs. So I came off realizing that only certain people can afford to take climate action. So I wondered what to do. So I started developing a sort of social system where we can give people money. And this has evolved into a new banking system. I didn't even know it, but I don't know what my question is really, but I'm really interested by what you're talking about. And the most interesting point at the moment for me, I'm not very good at talking, is leverage. So banking systems have come up in my head. I've written loads about new banking system, and based upon daily movement of money between different bank accounts to stop any debt or interest rates accruing. That's rather complicated to explain. But the thing about leverage points and Forrester and Donella Meadows, what I'm reading about there, we can use. I think. Do you have any? So we can use leverage both politically. So it's assuming we will never get a government in place who is capable, but we could possibly, in an autocratic, we could create leverage as happened in the Second World War when we had a cooperative government which put in place a big body of work that built the NHS. The William Beveridge report was commissioned by a cooperative government, not by a right or left government, and that required leverage. So this sort of idea of leverage is very, very important.
Yeah, look, I think that's why I was very delighted when Carbon Tracker approached me to write this report, because their point, and this is Mark Campanella, I think Mark's in the audience here, his idea was that people can't be persuaded to worry about what they think is the situation of people in 100 or 200 years. They're not really worrying about their own situation on 200 or 300 months. But they can't be made to worry about future generations, but they can be worried about their checkbook and their bank account. So the leverage point that Mark and Campanelli and Carbon Tracker gave me is people's pension funds. And so the report I wrote was about the damage to pensions. And ironically, as I started writing it, I received a document from my own superannuation fund. Being an Australian, I have a superannuation fund called UniSuper. And that told me that a 4.3 Celsius increase in global temperatures by 2100 is, and I quote, an acceptable risk to your portfolio. That's, of course, what's happening there is they have consultants, people like Mercer, and other consultants who make money out of advising councils and governments and so on. And they moderately innocently took the economic research and then put it into their glossy reports for pension funds, and basically telling some of them that 2 degrees of warming is better for the economy than zero. So, and what they didn't realize is that the typical thing that you're a consultant, you normally don't have a PhD. You normally admire people who get PhDs. So they've got this subservience to anybody who's published in academic literature. And when they see it, they think, oh, this must be done properly. and they read it. Well, I became an academic. I never thought I'd be able to take the idiots on. Clearly, I was wrong. But nonetheless, I don't give them that level of respect. If I see something published by a neoclassical economist, I expect it to be based on garbage. But the scale of garbage in this case just absolutely has horrified me. So I go on and take a look at it, and then it's incredibly easy to say, you should never have trusted this work. What that requires consultants to do is lift the academic veil and say, just because it's a referee doesn't mean it's good. Now, the trouble is consultants don't do that. But anyway, what's happened to courtesy of the Carbon Tracker report and the one that Tim Lenton worked with the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries is we now have weapons to take to pension funds and superannuation funds, insurance companies, anybody who's got a fiduciary duty. And that's, again, the power of what Carbon Tracker got me to do. If you have a fiduciary duty and you can show something like this as a member of the public, then you can say you are breaching your fiduciary duty to me. And if you get people together, we can sue you. Okay. So I think the best thing to go would be to particularly take the Carbon Tracker report, get a pension group. There are plenty of pension action groups around, show them this work and say, okay, now you should go to the next meeting of your council and say, unless you change your policies, we're going to sue you for breaching your fiduciary duty towards us.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. I hadn't got into the pension idea at all as a leverage.
Yeah. Well, hats off to Mark here for getting that idea in the first place.
My other question is more political, not political, to do with multimillionaires and where they put their money and how to persuade them to move their money. I hadn't thought about pensions. I'm gonna look into that, but using what's called my brain's gone blank, sorry, but the trade union movement bring thousands and thousands of people onto the streets using they use a particular type of conversation to activate action in people, and this could be done for multimillionaires for leverage, because their children matter too. They just don't know it yet, you know.
Yeah.
Thank you for your question, Lizzie. Did you want to take a moment to say anything about that, Stephen, or are we?
I'm happy with that. Let's just go on to the next question. Yeah.
We have a couple of there's two questions that I feel are, again, quite related. Richard, I'm sorry if I mispronounced your last name. Richard Nolthenius asks, so how do we motivate by power brokers the depowering of neoclassicals? Reasoning with them, as you point out, is a waste of our time. They only understand personal short-term motivations. And Chris Welch asks, what % of economists would you estimate are waking up to reality?
I'll start with the latter question. I'd say about 5 to 10%. Waking up. There's the non-orthodox economists. There are sort of about 3 or 4 major groups. There's Austrian economists who are even worse than neoclassicals. They understand equilibrium doesn't exist, but they're even more ideological about capitalism than the neoclassicals are, so forget about them. Post-Keynesians, that's a school of thought that I'm generally associated with, who've always been focused on realism, and then ecological economists, not the neoclassicals have tried to invade that field as well. So anybody who's a non-orthodox neoclassical economist, they're worthwhile. But you're talking, I mean, 5 to 10% if you're lucky. The rest of them, they're just useless, worse than useless, they're dangerous. If I got to be in a position of power where I could say, what the hell do we do to have any chance of surviving? One of the first things I'd do would be shut down economics departments across the planet. I'd only allow people to continue teaching economics who had published in a non-orthodox journal. And, I'd give one of the best reasons for universal basic income is to give economists money to shut up and not do anything. They're just deadly dangerous. They've got to be removed. So that's the sort of world we live in. So you can't. That's one reason I want to do that survey approach with Tim, because part of it's getting an alternative damage function. But the idea of having 160, that's why I want as many as possible, for 300 scientists to referee the shit that economists have published on climate change. And I think once scientists see the nonsense that economists have done, they will lose their professional reticence about encroaching on another area. So I'd love to get a couple of scientists in every university on the planet, that'd be my ideal, to read this stuff and say, holy hell, it's that stupid. What other stupid stuff comes out of the economics department? And then get a movement by scientists to drive economics out as a profession, as a discipline, drive it out of the university. It should be taught next to it should be taught next to Scientology.
Well, speaking of both your work with Tim Lenton and scientists mobilizing, we have Julia from Scientist Rebellion who would like to ask you a question. Go ahead,
Okay.
Julia.
Hi, thank you so much. It's really refreshing to hear such a frank talk. So your plan with Tim Lenton is great, but I'm wondering, Scientist Rebellion was essentially set up by two scientists throwing paint at the Royal Society, so calling out our own scientific institutions where the research has been supported and done and output. But who do not seem to be acting with the speed and the urgency which the climate emergency demands. And so alongside the work that you propose, how would you feel about being a bit more supportive of calling out our own institutions in their practices? I mean, those rubbish economist works should never have been funded in the first place. It seems to me they've been not only nonsense, but actively harmful. So how could we support changing our entire academic system to call that out, to stop that from happening? And would you join us in that effort?
I think the strategy Tim and I have is about the only way to effectively do it, because so long as, I mean, for example, the Economic and Social Research Council in the UK organised a rebuilding economics or rethinking economics research group way back in 2015, I think, and I got a small amount of funding out of that, which is where I did some work with Tim Garrett, who's another climate scientist, and Matteo Scriselli on the mathematics of energy in economics. But that fund hasn't continued on. The neoclassicals are now dominating the ESRG yet again. And so long as the Economic and Social Research Group is separate from the science group in terms of making decisions about funding, they'll continue giving money to neoclassical economists. So, and the same thing in America, the same thing in Australia. The Australian Research Council will continue turning down people like me and funding people like Nordhaus in the Australian situation. So the only way you can actually have any chance to stop it is to, and this is why, I mean, as horrible as it has to get to this situation, I've been fighting for 50 years to bring neoclassical economics down and failing abjectly to destroy them, but at least, becoming known for somebody who points out their absurdities. But the only way to really get rid of them is to have have scientists say, you guys don't belong in a university. You guys are pre-scientific. You're pre-Copernican. Okay. And they would never, again, because scientists understand science, they know, like a physicist, even though a physicist might think that other disciplines are stamp collecting, they won't go and try to do stamp collecting themselves. Whereas economists think they've got the wisdom of the universe, and they'll go into any bloody area, including climate change and everything else they've invaded with their idea of utility maximizing behavior and profit maximizing blah, blah, blahs as well. So the only way to do it now is say, well, look at what they've done with climate science, and get climate scientists to see it, and then get climate scientists saying in their own social circles, which of course means science departments, these guys are lunatics. We've got to get rid of them. So, I mean, I see the work that I want to do with Tim. It's ridiculous to say, but I think it's true. The most crucial research can be done right now. We need about $1.5 million to do it. We're trying to find somewhere to get the funding. If we can do it, then I think with that idea, particularly the idea of the survey, more so than working out an alternative damage function, getting scientists to post hoc referee those papers by climate economists and see just how stupid they are. And then that will spread the news through science departments of how dangerous economists are. And hopefully then we can get that going up to the level of funding bodies, and then have, say, whatever the Science Research Council is in the UK, to start talking. We want to have a talk to you guys in the ESRG about the sort of research you fund and why. So something to get scientists taking on economists. And the best tactic I think I've come up with is the one that Tim and I hope to do. Post hoc survey, post hoc referee, what should never have been published.
Okay, thank you very much. Definitely
Welcome.
sounds like a call to action to other scientists. Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Okay.
Sandra Faber wanted to know, might the leading catastrophic event that gets everyone's attention be the failure of endowment earnings, as for example at Harvard University, for which half of the income comes from their investments?
Yeah, this is the trouble. I mean, and again, the commercialization of universities is a huge part of the problem. And again, who argued for that? Economists. In fact, the whole idea of students paying fees, taking out debt rather to pay for the university education, that originated in Australia with a neoclassical economist. Very nice guy, and he's fucked up university education around the entire planet as a result, because once students have debt taken out and pay for their degree, they think they've bought it, and you get the whole bloody the quality of university education has plunged as a result of that. I'm sure many other academics here would have experienced the same thing that I've experienced over the last 40 years. So because we have fees for university students and industry funding and so on, that distorts the pure research we should have of universities being part of. So again, part of the system is say, forget it, the state should fund that. And this comes back to the modern monetary theory question somebody asked earlier. The essential point of modern monetary theory is that the state creates money. It doesn't borrow, it creates money. And what it should be doing is creating money for long-term issues that the private sector doesn't expect to get a return out of in the short term. And education is one of the classic things. You might think bureaucrats don't know how to spend money. Okay, give it to students. Let them spend. Okay. So, decently funded university education without the commercial bastardization that's happened over the last 40 years, that would be a better situation. So, but yeah, we have we've set up a system which is virtually incapable of making the decisions we need to make to get out of the predicament that system has put us in. And part of that is the commercialization of universities.
As everything else, Letitia has her hand up. I would like to ask a question. What would you like to ask Professor Keen, Letitia?
Hi, yes. Thanks for having me. You hear me well? Yeah. Also, I'm a French agronomist. I live in the US also. I am very informed about the bullshit of the saving time. I am involved with the NGO founded in the 80s, names HED, that combats double DST. And daylight saving time, do you still hear me? Do you hear me?
It's a bit difficult to hear you. You sound a
bit your voice is breaking up.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I'm going to remove my AirPods. Does it work better?
Sounds a bit
better. That's
better.
Yes, yeah, please. That's better. Yeah.
Also, I need to put sorry, I'm going to put it on my ear. Do you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say is daylight saving time is an accelerator of carbon emissions, and opposite of it, natural time for zones for climate is an opportunity. I don't know if you're aware of it, because daylight saving time reduces sleep, and the less people sleep, the less healthy, but also the more they consume. And the less light in the morning, the more light in the evening, the more heating, the more air conditioning, and the more car transportation. People use their car more because they can't walk. And what I want to say, so the artificial light that is put forward is a cherry picking, a small benefit in confront of an enormous waste and overconsumption. So my question is, do you know economists interested and capable of calling out the bullshit of daylight saving time, explaining the opportunity of natural time zones for climate? And I'll be willing to pinpoint to tag BS studies.
I don't think that's an interesting thought, but I don't think I think it's important, for example, of shutting down Bitcoin or shutting down the international aviation in terms of reducing carbon footprint. But yeah, there's a couple of economists who want to sensibly talk about abolishing all time zones and having a one time zone for the whole planet. So there's some worthwhile work, but I'm sorry, I don't see it as a major issue. I'd rather talk about other questions here.
So, speaking of, Matt Rodriguez wants to know actual well-being. Economists should be measuring something else. No, I'm reading Jason Hickel's book, and it is rather illuminating on the choice of GDP as a unit of measurement. It just measures capitalistic growth, but not the rest of the elements. Are there economists who are using other stuff?
There are things like the happiness index and stuff like that. I'm not particularly fussed about that area for two reasons. One is that it's just too hard to say let's measure it differently and think we're going to get a different result. We're in a capitalist system, we'll still get accumulation of power and wealth and waste and outsourcing. So people say privatizing the gains and socializing the losses is a large part of capitalist behavior. That's still going to happen no matter how we measure GDP. Secondly, one thing which made me think, well, GDP is actually a reasonable measure in some ways, is when I did work on the relationship between energy and GDP. And when you look at energy at the global level and GDP at the global level, they're both rising, obviously, but you get a ludicrous correlation between the two, not just in terms of the actual levels, but even the rates of change. So the correlation of the rate of change of a GDP to the rate of change of energy is 0.86, which is ridiculously high. And what that implies is that what GDP is indirectly measuring is that fundamentally GDP is turning energy into useful work. So it's a reasonable guide to the extent we're using energy, and that's the main problem. So again, I think it'd be important to have a far more valid measure, not of GDP, but of our impact upon the biosphere. And if we properly measured our impact on the biosphere, it's always going to be negative. We come down to the second law of thermodynamics. We're going to do work, we're going to create more waste than we create order. So you're going to get a negative measure. The point would be trying to minimize that negative measure while still maintaining a civilization.
Yeah, Timothée Parikh in 2020 did that really great meta study of 835 peer-reviewed papers that proved that there is no decoupling of GHG emissions, resource use, and GDP. So, yeah, those arguments don't hold water. Pete Newton wanted to ask, how is it that educated intellectual persons able to think freely cannot see the detrimental effects and existential threat of capitalist economics on the very existence of the biological populations of the entire planet?
We know that it takes a very special orientation to be able to even think about the issues beyond your own immediate circle. Most humans don't. Okay, so our own species, we have an incredible, we're highly intelligent and highly dumb in how we organize ourselves. I often say humans are the opposite of ants, individually intelligent, collectively stupid. But the other side of it is that the capacity to think exponentially is not something which is common with humans. Systems thinking is necessary to capture all that. So the sort of system dynamic stuff that I was talking about favorably beforehand, I think we need to be teaching that as kindergarten virtually to get people to think in a systemic way and look outside their own immediate environment. We'll need that to be able to survive as a future species, but clearly our failure to do that is why we're in the predicament we are in now.
Yeah, another person I'm actually going to have a talk with soon, Luke Kemp, is also a big proponent of systems thinking because everything's interdependent and working in silos doesn't account for the way things impact one another. So Laurie Moulton's asking if you can say something regarding Lord Stern's current narrative.
Yeah, look, Nicholas, I haven't met him personally. We've had a couple of conversations on radio. He's a decent human being. I'll give him that. But if you read the Stern report, you'll find that he used Chris Hope's Page model as part of it to estimate the damages from climate change. And at one point there, he has 10 degrees of warming causing a 12% fall in GDP. So he's just as naive as all the other economists about the scale of damages. He doesn't understand the climate. And this is because he's an economist. So I'm not sure of the particular page. I can't give you page references straight away. But if you do read the Stern report, look for something involving the word hope or page, and you'll find an estimate. And it's a probabilistic estimate system. It's rather more complicated than most of the integrated assessment models that economists have produced. But literally 10 degrees of warming, I think it's even 7% damages to GDP out of 10 degrees of warming. And Nicholas Stern, pardon me, he's an economist. He knows fuck all about the climate. He knows slightly more fuck all than the ones who produced this nonsense. He's now fighting against them, as is Joe Stiglitz. So I'm very pleased they've both joined in. But it's far too late. It's also far too little, but at least it's happening. So, I'll applaud Nicholas Stern for finally trying to turn the direction around, but he contributed to a lot of this stuff without being aware he was even doing it.
maybe he just needs to have more conversation with you so you can radicalize him further. Maddie Vesa-Volanen is asking, wartime economy, the phrase that you use, on the basis of militarism, nation against each other, or on the basis of ecological realism? Could you find a better name for it?
I don't know. I think the only way we're going to preserve ourselves as the intelligent species on this planet is to behave intelligently and know the future directions of the solar system. We know the Earth's got about 300 million years before the sun expands sufficiently to drive all the moisture off the planet. So we know that life won't survive unless we manage to, get life off the planet sometime in the next 300 million years. So we have to see ourselves as being intelligent enough to know what's going to happen in a way that other species aren't going to learn about. Maybe not necessarily because they're less intelligent than us, but because they don't have opposable thumbs. There's plenty of research. I've seen research arguing dolphins and sperm whales have got more brain power than humans, but they can't do anything about it. So we're the ones who know what's going to happen to life on the planet. We should be trying to preserve life on the planet. And that should be the first orientation of everything humans do. Whereas instead it's about, consuming more and getting a more comfortable lifestyle for ourselves. That's been what we've been focusing upon. We don't even realize we're a predator.
I was talking to a friend recently about the genocides that we've caused and cavalierly don't even care about or know. Last question I'm going to take, and then we're just going to have a quick feedback or checkout round. William Harmony wants to know, the question that I have is, where is the digital system that humans will use to not only understand the impacts effects of climate change, but also simultaneously help them inventory, manage, distribute, and deploy the most efficacious solutions available to achieve the best possible climate trajectory? Because what we do not have is a universal system that will help us apply them in the right order, permutation, combination over time in a truly coordinated and concerted manner. I'm going to put that in the chat because it was long, so you might want to refer to it, but please.
I mean, we basically have information systems that we never had beforehand, and we should be using those to get a systemic view of what we're doing to the biosphere. Definitely. The technology I mentioned I happen to be selling commercially to finance my activities is an information management system, and analysis system. So yes, we do need to do that sort of thing. But of course, we're not going to do it before we blow the place up. So it's only when we put it together afterwards, we have to have an incredibly complex view of the damage of what we do on the planet and what we do to the biosphere. And like in that sense, we're talking about global warming right now because carbon dioxide is the most obvious and dangerous and exponentially increasing damage we're doing to the biosphere. But in some ways, I think we're lucky we're having an energy crisis in that sense, because if we had a biodiversity crisis, if we trip the biodiversity system completely over, then that's it. We're not going to exist. So in a way, I'd rather have this crisis than a biodiversity one. But we are having biodiversity as well. So we have to then, one huge measure has to be, what are we doing to the biodiversity of the planet? And ultimately, I think human civilization, I know E.O. Wilson made this point. He wanted to reserve half the planet for non-human species. I'd go further. I'd rather reserve about 80% of the planet, but say there's, at least half the planet where humans are not allowed to go, period. Any human that goes there is either checking on other humans or being dragged out by a drone for breaching the rule. So we have to make sure literally at least half the planet is reserved so that humans can't touch it.
Be amazing. I'm going to put some last links for everyone in the chat. So again, the professor's Substack, his Patreon, and the next steps document with all the links, well, not all the links, but some of the links that he referenced in his talk, as well as how to support the lovely groups that are co-hosting this. So thank you to, you're welcome, William. Thank you to Money Rebellion, Scientist Rebellion, XR UK, and Extinction Rebellion Global for co-hosting this talk with us. Thank you, of course, Professor Keane, for being here on your birthday. And I do want to just have a last sort of a checkout round for everybody. If there's a link that says, so the question is, what's one word that describes how you feel about today's talk? So if you click that link, it'll take you to a place where we can make a word cloud. So we can just sort of gather feedback as a I don't know what just happened. Gather feedback as a checkout. And we have more talks coming up soon. And oh, for those who are interested in the recording because they weren't able, friends of yours that might not have been able to attend, or if you want to look back at some of the information Professor Keen shared, it should be up on both the Scientist Rebellion and the Extinction Rebellion UK YouTubes shortly. So,
and I'll get a copy of that for my own websites as well. Thanks to Dana, that'd be great.
Of course, of course. It's the least we could do. Thank you so much for all the time that you spent with us. And thank you all for coming and spending the time as well. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. And yeah, hope to see you at the coming talks. Have a beautiful afternoon, everyone.
Bye.
Bye, loves.
Thank you.